And we have, fortunately, if I may put it, 3, not 4 presenters this afternoon. Dr. Shafika Muas, and then Mr. Joseph Mbalaka, and then Dr. Kasim Devet. Dr. Kasim Devet, fortunately, is with us. He was supposed to have left, and Allah knows best, his flight was delayed. So we welcome them, and we hope that you will also enjoy their presentations. So, Dr. De Blanche.
All right, good afternoon, audience, and thank you for your patience. You've been very good. So the last stretch, so bear with us. Just a few more interesting things to hear from our panel. So the panel 4 is on women, children, and youth. Our first presenter is Dr. Shafika Moose from UCT, University of Cape Town. I will just introduce you. Dr. Shafika Moose is a social worker with over 20 years experience in the NGO sector, specializing in the field of gender-based violence and trauma interventions. She works at Rape Crisis Cape Town and is also part of the University of Cape Town's Department of Social Development as a social work student supervisor. Dr. Moose's interest in women and gender studies has led to a specific research focus that being the dialectic between gender politics and Islamic traditions. She situates her work in the frame of a discursive construction of gender, ethical, and religious subjectivity. In her current research, she explores South African Muslim mothers' constructions of maternal identity in relation to their Islamic faith tradition within their contemporary social context. Dr. Moose.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Shukran to the conference organizers for the invitation to speak today, and in acknowledgement of my co-panelist and also the moderator. I'm going to do a very short presentation today, hopefully under 10 minutes. And the presentation is based largely on a very small part of my doctoral thesis, which I finished recently. And the thesis really looked, as was so beautifully introduced by our moderator, at the topic of the maternal identity and Muslim women, and more specifically focused on the discursive construction of South African Muslim women's maternal identities as a form of religious subjectivity. Now, that can all sound like gobbledygook, so I'm going to just try and make it as simple as possible. So to begin, unfortunately, I don't have a PowerPoint at the moment, but I'm going to read from my slides and outline the structure of my presentation first so that you can have an idea of the flow of the presentation. I'm going to start by introducing the background to the thesis very briefly, just to help people locate themselves in terms of where am I coming from, why am I doing this topic, what does it have to do with Islam, and the relevance of it to us in present-day South Africa. I'm then going to go on to using 2 excerpts from my interviews with Muslim women, and that is the core of my thesis. I sat with Muslim women, talked to them about their mothering and how they relate that to their Islamic faith in terms of ethics and all of that. So I'm going to use 2 excerpts from my research to demonstrate how some of these women did what I call the discursive construction of the maternal identity in relation to their faith tradition. Using the excerpts, I'm then going to give a very brief analysis of why I argue that what they do is actually a form of ethical subject formation, and it represents their religious subjectivity as current-day South African Muslim women in a real-world context. And I'll conclude with a few remarks about why I am arguing or suggesting that Islamic ethics, from my perspective, needs to be real, lived, and contemporary, and that it's possible. And in fact, these women are doing it. So, to begin, as I said, the presentation is largely based on my thesis, which I finished recently. I interviewed a number of South African Muslim women with the aim of exploring their experiences of motherhood in relation to their Islamic religious tradition. An important part of the dissertation examined the discourses which the women engage in and draw on in their representation of their lived experiences as Muslim mothers. In doing so, I aim to understand how the women's religious subjectivities are influenced by and reflect on dominant renderings of motherhood in Islamic traditional discourses. Normative motherhood concepts, such as that motherhood is a desirous identity which women should aspire to and meet with joyful compliance, tend to obscure the day-to-day reality of complex psychosocial challenges that mothers navigate, often short of substantive guidance from religious sources. In this presentation, I approach motherhood as an experiential site of knowledge production, in which mothers engage in a dialectical negotiation of their Muslim identity vis-à-vis their socio-cultural and ethico-religious life worlds. So using excerpts from my thesis, or from the interviews that I did with Muslim mothers, I discuss some of these dialectical engagements as complex negotiations between various sets of ethical scripts aimed at producing social solutions to contemporary family and parenting challenges. I conclude with the argument that these Muslim women's construction of their maternal subjectivities represent a form of lived contemporary Islamic ethics. So now I'm going to go to the excerpts to demonstrate what I've just set out to do. And the excerpts, maybe just to give some background. These are women who come from Cape Town. They are women that we would consider moms, daughters, sisters, women we know well, women who come from the Cape Flats, from townships and so on. Normal women, like, your everyday Muslim woman, quote unquote. So these are women that I've interviewed and that I've spoken to, and these excerpts come from them in terms of their actual experiences with their children, with their families, and in their lives. So the first excerpt is from one particular woman who talks to me about her 10-year-old daughter, and her daughter comes to her and presents this scenario which most of us, if we're parents today, won't be too far from our reality. So the 10-year-old daughter says to me that her 10-year-old daughter comes to her and she says, I was invited to a disco party. She's 10 years old. She's not mukallaf yet. And then I had to do the whole, okay, so this is her best friend, but discos are not something that I want her to go to. But then what I did was I investigated, and I found out that it was only going to be girls. There was going to be no boys. So I sat her down, and I told her that I'm going to let you go for 2 reasons. One, you're not mukallaf yet. And I told her that when you are mukallaf, things change. This is not going to be allowed. But because you're not mukallaf and there's only going to be girls, you can go. But you need to be mindful of the fact that when you become mukallaf, the rules become different. Okay. So that's excerpt 1, and we'll have a look at what's all going on there in terms of this mother trying to construct a response that reflects the different sets of, as I said, ethical conundrums that's being presented in the scenario. The second one is another mom talking about her teenage boys, young teenage boys, and also a scenario that was presented to her by one of her sons. She says, our children grow up in such a busy time They're exposed to so much more than I feel I was when I grew up. And yes, as a Muslim mom, there's certain guidelines that we have to follow, but sometimes it's so hard. There are times when I think, do I deviate and say it's okay to do something that's not acceptable? Like an example would be, there's a party at Grand West. So I just have a little asterisk saying that Grand West is a casino, an entertainment complex based on a casino in Cape Town, but it has other entertainment areas like ice skating and I don't know what else. But so she says, so there's a party at Grand West. Do I say yes? Is it okay? Because the party's on the other side, away from the casino. Or do I say no, because it's Grand West? So it's hard to say that there can be an ideal Muslim mom, because there's so much other factors that's built in that makes it hard to just be strict and say, this is it, or nothing else. So I had copious amounts of excerpts like this that I could refer to, but just for brevity and for purposes of the presentation, those are the two I'm going to present. Okay, so in terms of these two excerpts, this is basically my argument in terms of this being a form of ethical construction of the self. The difficulty of mothering in current-day South African society is a theme that appeared in all of the participants that I included in my study. Additionally, all of them demonstrated rigorous efforts in grappling with the demands of contemporary mothering in a faith-based context. Cultivating an Islamic identity in their children amidst the challenges of other influential social factors was for these mothers one of the biggest challenges, but at the same time, one of their biggest mothering aspirations. And the way in which they did this, cultivating this Islamic identity in this challenging terrain, this was very particular to each woman, so every woman had her own style of how she approached this. And it's also where the interesting reflections of ethical subject formation and identity construction can be found. These excerpts reflect on changing social norms of contemporary society and the multiple challenges which Muslim mothers reported being presented with in their decision-making as it pertained to setting the limits of acceptable versus unacceptable behavior with their children within the parameters of the Sharia. They particularly highlight their struggles at times with the simple application of normative concepts of halal and haram against other socio-cultural factors that affect their decision-making process. It's clear in both of these excerpts, as it was with many others, how these mothers employ various reasonings, negotiations, fact-finding, and research to craft meaningful responses to their children, which both recognize their children's participation in the broader social environment of school, friends, society, trends, etc., but also and importantly, the moral and legal parameters of the Islamic faith tradition. This process of constructing responses and in doing so, similarly constructing ethical frameworks of action that accommodate both a commitment to Islamic identity whilst being able to engage their children in their social context is what I propose to be a form of lived contemporary Islamic ethics. However, this is not to say that this process that these mothers engage in is straightforward and without complications. As much as it is clear that the mothers in the study developed quite innovative responses to some of the ethical conundrums they faced as moms, most, if not all, of the women spoke to the difficulty of constantly needing to think in these multiple and complex ways about how to deliberate on these issues and accommodate various sets of competing needs. Sometimes this led to incongruencies, as in the above narrations, where potentially, from an Islamic legal point of view, some of these decisions can't in fact be accommodated. And the mothers wrestled with this incongruencies as a guilt-inducing consequence of feeling that they were potentially transgressing or non-conforming to some overarching religion codex of rules governing what they should and shouldn't be doing. In conclusion, in ethical theory, ethics can be said. Time?
Yes.
Well, then you're going to have to ask for the conclusion at a later date. But I'll wrap it up in a few sentences. In ethical theory, ethics can be said to represent the ordinary doings and sayings of people in their everyday comportment. Rather than being solely based on the strict adherence to prescribed moral codes, the ethical condition denotes a human responsiveness to the immanence of ordinary, everyday action making up social life. In a nutshell, this is what characterized the women's responses. Throughout the study, they showed consistently an active process of serious attention to the holistic set of circumstances presented each time by their children or various parenting scenarios. And each time, they would discern the best ethical path of action that they would respond with, taking into consideration their religious laws, cultural norms, social contextual factors, and in this holistic purview, came up with responses that remain rooted in Islamic core values, whilst attending to the real-world context of their and their children's lives. Shukran very much. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you. Mr. Joseph Mbalaka is a PhD candidate at University of KwaZulu-Natal. His research focuses on the decolonization of Yawa history in Eastern and Southern Africa and poses an analysis that unpacks their socio-economic contribution to this region. Please, Mr. Mbalaka, floor is yours.
Okay. In the morning, I was listening attentively to the speakers, and almost 4 speakers mentioned something on the Yao people. For example, Professor Alfred Matiki, Brother Ilyas Yassini, and 2 speakers also mentioned something about the Zanzibari people. And these are Sheikh Said Langa, Brother Abd Peterson. Then I started asking, why 2 key words are popping up in this conference? The Zanzibaris and the Yao people. Actually, my topic, although it's not coming up, it's more about the Yao women. You can see the connection between the Yao people and the Zanzibari people. So in future, the future research, when you are writing the history of the people in Southern Africa, or South Africa in particular, if you don't mention the Yao people, then that history will be incomplete. Why I'm saying so? Because the Yao people are part of the Zanzibaris. So the Zanzibaris are also the Yao and Makua people. Not only saying Zanzibaris, you have to mention that they are Makua and Yao people. Now my topic is the Yao Muslim. Why I was interested in this topic? The study seeks to examine the migration and settlement of Yao Muslim women in South Africa with a particular focus on how they are negotiating identity in this country. Much of the work, the previous works, centered on male Muslim migrants from Malawi. So this is the first work which is dealing with women migrants from Malawi, in particular the Yao people. These women, the Yao people, the majority of them, they are illiterate. There are reasons why these Yao women are illiterate, but because of the time, I cannot explain. Yao Muslims, Yao women, Yao men have been marginalized for a long time. You can understand my plea at this age. I'm doing PhD at 55 years of age. And I did my BA while I was over 40. Why? We have been marginalized in our country. The purpose. These women are especially vulnerable due to the fact that they are often lack employment contracts in this country, such as pensions or medical assistance. They also have little or no protection against their employers. They are exploiting them. They feel afraid to report abuse, exploitation to the local police for fear of arrest and deportation. the general workers, cleaners, salespeople, fast food workers, and housemaids. I'm just fast. So the methodology, this study undertook a critical scrutiny of the data with the help of this theory known as writing history from below. I'm writing history below for ordinary women, marginalized women, not writing the history of politicians. This is the theory which was started by E.P. Thompson. I borrowed from the one who wrote The Making of the English Working Class. It's all dealing about the Yao. I'm continuing. So it took a qualitative approach using unstructured interviews with 30 Yao Muslim women to explore their lived experiences in this country. Implications. The study seeks to give a voice to marginalized women in Southern Africa. All narratives corrected from the Yao people will add a new perspective to understanding Malawian migrant women in this country. That's why I'm saying the future research. If someone writes the history of this country, he or she must mention the Yao people. Findings. The study reveals that rampant corruption in our country, Malawi, nepotism, tribalism. There was a question somewhere, they were asking, do you mean tribalism has ended in Malawi? Actually, it hasn't ended. Yao Muslims are marginalized even now. And Christian missionaries are targeting Yao areas to Christianize them. Sister Sifat said about it, and it's true. For example, there are some missionaries who are coming from Australia and Europe in order to Christianize Yao Muslims in Malawi. So I'm urging scholars here, please help the emerging scholars in Malawi. There are many Yao people who are starting to write their history, but they don't have money, they don't have funds. I've heard that there's an ambassador from Turkey here. I would also urge from her to help Muslim scholars in Malawi. So, poor service driven in our country is also forcing women to migrate to this country. Early marriages, high divorce rates. This light is killing me. That's why it's killing me. Early marriages, high divorce rates is also common among Muslims in Malawi. Why they are marrying at early age? Because they want the men, they think the men will empower them. Because they were discriminated. They are not educated secularly. In Malawi, for example, you see my name is Joseph Mbalaka. Why I'm Joseph? Originally it's Yusuf. But I changed to Joseph in order to pass the exams. Yes. It took, like I told you, imagine, I started my BA 2011. All this time, we have been marginalized for a long time in our country. That's why I'm urging scholars, please help Malawians, new emerging scholars. So the other finding that good governance in Malawi is necessary to tackle inequalities. Yao areas are totally marginalized. The values, anyway, you'll find it in my article. Now, just introduction. Who are the Yao people? The Yao have a long tradition of migrating from their homeland, that is Mozambique, to other areas. They had settled in Mozambique at a hill called Yao. And from the name of that hill, the tribe now we see Yao. Yao is the name of a hill in Mozambique. Now, when did the Yao start coming to this country? That's the question. That's why I'm saying the history of Islam should also talk about the Yao people. They started coming to this country, for example, back in 1800s, when migrant workers from Malawi were coming to work in the gold and diamond mines. Then the second wave is about the Makua people, the indentured rebels. When we talk about the Zanzibaris, these are the people who came in 1870s to work in the sugar plantations. They were Muslims, few Christians, and few Christians of the Yao and Makua went to settle in Inanda, where they married Christians, fellow Christians, and their culture ended. But the Muslim, Makua and Yao, they still retained their Yao Islamic identity in Chaswet, Bellevue. The reasons I will not mention why they come here, because of poverty, corruption, tribalism, I've already mentioned that. Why Durban? Because of the Islamic influence. There are many Muslims in Durban. So these people, they are women, they prefer working for Indians and whites rather than being employed by indigenous people. Only 3 women from Malawi told me they worked for a black family, Zulu family. Only 3. So the interaction between Malawian women and Indian women is cordial. However, many respondents mentioned racism among some few Indian, Bangladesh, Egyptian Muslims when they are working as domestic workers. Sometimes these Malawian women, they receive expired canned food, old spoiled food, old clothes from their employees. So they were complaining that there is somehow racism which is taking place. Then there is cultural exchange, food. These Yao, they brought ugari, they cook ugari. Now even the Zulu women, they can eat ugari. In the past, many Zulu women could only eat what is known uputu with sour milk in Komazi. And also they have introduced clothing, chitenje. Professor, lastly, before I go, I want to show you what these young women have introduced in this country on culture, chitenje. Some will not know chitenje. In Kiswahili, they say kitenge. So, Professor Amina Ngumbano, please stand for me. I want the people to see how chitenje looks. This is, you see, this is an Islamic attire. That is an Islamic attire introduced by the Yao women. Asante sana.
Mr. Mbalaka, for this interesting presentation, and I think your call and your pleas have been heard, have fallen into the right ears. Right, our next and last speaker of today is Dr. Kasim Devet. Dr. Kasim completed a BCom degree at University of the Western Cape, UWC. He served as treasurer on the Deaf Provincial Council of Deaf SA from 1999 to 2002, and World Committee Safety Representative from 2019 to 2022. He also acted as chairperson of the Dominican School for the Deaf in Witterboom, Cape Town, southern suburb. Over the years, he has been a campaigner for the advocacy of the right of Muslim deaf persons and their right to Islamic education. During February 2019, he, with his EXCO team, took 58 deaf plus 62 hearing people on the minor pilgrimage, Humrah, is that how you pronounce it? During that year, the ministries of churches awarded him an honorary doctorate for community development.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Shukran to the organizers for allowing us this opportunity to present this paper on the deaf community in Cape Town, and in particular, the Muslim deaf community. maybe earlier on, Professor said that we need to stand and stretch our legs a little bit, take a break, but then we continued. But it looks like I've got at least 30 minutes for the speech, Dr. Assam. We went so well with the time, I thought I had that extra time. I just want to demonstrate something to you, maybe. And that maybe will loosen the limbs a little bit. In sign language, the greeting of Assalamu alaikum is peace be with you. All right, we stay back a bit. Peace be with you. Right, so if that's all I did, then at least we're going home with a benefit. So if anybody meets you in the street and not talking to you, you can use that sign, inshallah. But normally, in slang, as I've heard with different speakers about the language, the deaf will just say, Assalamu alaikum. So the South African deaf community currently stands at 4 million people and counts for approximately 6% of this country's population. This stat was from DEFSA, but it was in 2006. So stats on deaf people, you can't find any of that. So if there's any fundus at research, please help me get that right, inshallah. The South African Human Science Research Council recently published a report on education throughput of young learners, deaf learners. In many cases, the identification of impaired hearing in a child takes place at such a late stage in their lives that they have already become disillusioned and dropped out of school, which leaves large gaps in their education. Our deaf education, our education in South Africa is putrid. Prior to 1994 and our freedom, we felt that we had poor education, but I think, that's my opinion, that education right now is terrible. Now just imagine the plight of a deaf person. Only 10 years ago was teaching methods for in deaf education. And this resulted in principals and teachers, although they've had years and years of experience in deaf education, they have not yet come to terms with the teaching deaf methodology. And every time a new trend comes in, they jump ship to the new trend. And this interrupts that learning process for the deaf person. In addition to this, there was a belief that a young learner who learns a spoken language will later on easily adapt and adopt a signed language. Whereas there is a lot of evidence to the contrary, that a deaf learner should learn a signed language first, and later on it will be easier to adapt to a spoken language. Now, why do we want deaf people to speak if they struggle to hear sound and they struggle to speak? In Afrikaans here in Cape Town, we refer to them as deaf and dumb, or doof en dom. Now just imagine I start calling one of you out and say, can you speak? No, you can't. You are dumb. And mostly they don't use their voice because they don't know how they sound. And I must tell you, I have a deaf daughter. When they're out in public and they speak, the octaves is through the roof. And you can't understand exactly what they're saying. They're trying to speak to you. They're trying to verbalize. But you cannot understand them unless you've been around them for a while. For example, we have some brothers here from West Africa. It takes some time to adjust to, your language here. So, I mean, I don't mean that in a derogatory manner. I just mean that is how difficult it is. So for a deaf person in a spoken world, spoken language world, it is extremely difficult. So if that is the case in general, can you imagine the problem that a deaf Muslim learner has? Just imagine that you are not able to hear the adhan, or somebody reciting the Quran, or your mother calling your name. Sorry, I always get hot when I speak on the subject. Or your sibling taking the mickey out of you, something that hearing people have a problem with. Or a car hooting next to you when you're in danger. And this is the struggle that a deaf person has. Now, the Muslim community in Cape Town and across the world is well known for its benevolence. We build mosques, we build HIF schools, we distribute food parcels, food, we build wells. But the Muslim community is still asleep as far as this community is concerned, the deaf Muslim community. Because if we can't educate them at school properly, how can we educate them in Islam? The Tablighi movement, they go to countries and they go and preach Islam. But we have a community right here and we can't reach them. So 27 years ago, Al-Waqa Madrasa was founded. And this is to address that problem that we have with the deaf community. But when we started out, we found that we had so many challenges that we had to learn how to sign. So those people are learned in the subject, they have to sign, which takes a long time. And then we also found that the deaf has a culture. And this culture exists because they grow up in our homes, but they are unable to understand what we are saying. They don't know our language, whether it is English or Afrikaans or whatever the case may be. They are unable to hear that language. They can't speak the language. So that 30 minutes is out? Okay. So we have decided that we cannot just have a madrasa. We need to reach the young learner at a young age. And we started the Oasis Academy, where with a Montessori philosophy, we will have an integrated and inclusive school. Because we need to reach them at that age. We also need to reach our youth, which now 80% of the deaf community are unlettered, illiterate, and so they cannot find jobs. In South Africa in particular, you have to have a matric certificate before you can apply for a job as a sweeper or a cleaner. So geography and history doesn't help when you sweep with a broom, right? So this is a historical and monumental movement for the Muslim community in Cape Town, because this does not exist anywhere. And with a failed education system, we believe that with the Montessori method, which doesn't use language so much as a language of instruction, we should be able to take many of the young deaf learners to matric level and beyond. Shukran. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kasim, for bringing awareness to this great. It is a concern in our society that we shouldn't neglect any part of our society, no matter how they are. Thank you very much. We come to the end of this session. So, yes, we have 10 minutes. We'll take a few questions.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. This is maybe a question to Dr. Kazim. Jazakumullah khairan for that very spirited, I would say, presentation, which also very touched my heart as well, because I have a deaf cousin. And just last week, he's telling me that he wants me to help him get married, and I couldn't understand him. I had to go get an interpreter because I can't sign, and only then I understood what he wanted. So perhaps the question is, how do you advise then those of us who live with people who are deaf, in terms of, I mean, it's the language is very difficult. So what advice would you give to us in terms of how to deal with this phenomena? Jazakumullah khairan.
Shukran for that question. The answer is simple. All of us use sign language, right? One way or the other. Particularly when you're in the traffic and somebody cuts you off, you show him certain signs, but we don't want that signs. So the way to do this is you have to learn sign language. If you go to Saudi Arabia, well, I wish that I could, but if you go to Saudi Arabia, you learn certain words, right? I only understand khamsa riyal. However, kam hada khamsa riyal. However, on the other hand, if you learn how to sign, then you will be able to communicate with that deaf person. That is their handicap. Their handicap has gone from being a physiological issue or a medical issue to a physical barrier, and that is lack of sign. And sign language is very easy. You know, the problem with sign language is that you have to do certain things. You have to face the person, so you can't turn around and say, "Can you hear me?" All right. So you have to face the person. You have to have nice light like this that makes me so hot, and it comprises of three things. It's the sign, it is the movement of that sign, and it's also facial expression and body language. Okay? So you have to be a bit of an actor. So I just want to just tell you one story. We had a young couple who wanted to get married, and the groom was deaf. And we take him to the imam, and we explain to the imam, this guy wants to get married. But the imam has no idea how to explain to the groom what he's going to say in this contract. So there was an interpreter interpreting, and of course he's watching the interpreter. And the imam says, I think this groom must get serious now. If he wants to get married, he should look at me. All right, so that explains your dilemma. But we have to learn sign language. At Al-Waqa we teach maybe 3 blocks in a year, sign language. All right?
Assalamu alaikum. I think mine is more of a comment with regards to townships. While we might be doing dawah to everybody else, but the deaf community is highly neglected because majority of people don't know sign language. So mine is to say, while we're looking at the concept of dawah and everything, I think also sign language is also important, because then who is going to give them the message of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala if we can't? Shukran.
Okay, just a few points about the so-called Zanzibaris. Now we know that they're not really Zanzibaris, they're from northern Mozambique mainly. It was the indentured laborers who brought from India specifically to work on the sugarcane farms. And among them, about 8% were Muslims. The majority were Hindus, a few Christians. As far as Zanzibaris are concerned, or so-called Zanzibaris, the story is the following. I'm not sure, maybe the others can verify this. They were not brought specifically to work on the sugarcane farms. The story is that they were taken as slaves. They were on a ship. By that time, slavery had been abolished, 1932, I think it was, 1832. And then the British brought them, because Natal was now colonized by the British. So they brought them to Durban. And so they didn't come to Durban because of the Muslim presence. They were brought to Durban. and they're working on the ports in Durban Harbour. So the first location was what's called a bluff. The bluff is those who know when the ships enter the signal is given from the top for the ships to enter and so on. That's the bluff area. So they were there. There's still a masjid there. And that the Zanzibari community was living in that area. The masjid is there. And one of the imams was actually Malay. So it's very interesting, right? He passed away now, it's quite late. What happened is when the government decided to implement the Group Areas Act, they wanted to send the Zanzibari community to live among the blacks, among the Africans. So they approached the trustees of the Grey Street Masjid, and they said, look, we got a problem because we are Muslim, and if we're going to live in this community, we will lose our identity. So it was the trustees, that means the Indian Muslim community trustees, interceded with the government to make sure that they are given a special status. That is how they ended up in Chatsworth. So that's the history. But what's interesting now, a few years ago, they are talking about their identity. They say they're living in this Indian area, they're not Indians. And they want to go back to Bluff, the original area. And so they've been negotiating. I'm not sure how far it's gone, but this whole issue was even televised, it was on television. So just a few points about this community.
Emerging scholars, what can we do to help and support young Muslim people of Malawi?
Well, as you heard from Professor, I was trying to explain the origins of the Zanzibaris, who are known as the Makua and the Yao people, how they came in this country. So actually, what we need in Malawi, we want to know where they came from in Mozambique. Now, to go to Mozambique, if you are coming from Malawi, it needs what? Resources, money. For example, I myself, I'm only doing a part-time lecturing at University of KZN. The money I receive is little. So I can't manage going to Mozambique deep in Mwembe area. It's very far. So the problem is funding. Yeah, funding for education.
Zikomo.
Zikomo kwambiri. Oh, thank you. Then, praise be to God. Yeah, so if you fund us, it will be easy to explore more on the Yao history. You heard Professor has explained the way they came. They were freed from slavery, is it? So they were brought in Durban. They are the Yao and Makua people. And the Makua people are found in northern Mozambique. Northern province of Mozambique, Niassa province. In Niassa province is where you find the Yao. The Yao and the Makua are cousins. And when the Yao left Malawi, going to Malawi, they left the Makua people. Some of the branch of the Makua people, known as the Lomwe, they followed the Yao in Malawi. So they are somehow related. So that's why I want to dig more about these people. Yeah. Unfortunately, funding.
Of course, he's from the Consulate General here in Cape Town, and we have our Consul General sitting among us here. But in any case, I just wanted to tell you about this opportunity of Turkey providing scholarships for undergraduates and graduate students. For instance, that includes doctorate and also masters. We just recently announced that we are giving 13 scholarships to students, South African students now. We can also provide scholarships for students from Malawi, also internship in our academic institutions in Turkey. So there's this thing called Turkey scholarships. I would recommend you to apply for that to further do your research and your, the remaining, I don't know, your PhD in Turkey. About funding inside South Africa, let's talk about it. Of course, we are open to more cooperation in the education field, and we have some funds, though limited. Thank you.
Our time is up, unfortunately. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Assam, for moderating the session. Lots of important papers, again, as we had heard throughout the day. I think we just read a point of exhaustion. I'm sure many of you who have been here the whole day experienced that, but I think it was very enriching, very informative, very educational. And I think it is just a pity that we run up against time, and of course we are human, we are frail, we get tired. So please do forgive us for really imposing the time limits on these. We had another presenter who was supposed to have been with us, but unfortunately due to some problem at our South African embassy, they couldn't find his passport. He was given a visa, but he couldn't join us. Nonetheless, thank you for being here. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you, moderator. And we look forward to another long day tomorrow. Interesting sessions. Two are important, specifically partly because the Congress has been dedicated to two important iconic individuals. One is Sheikh Abu Bakr Effendi, who basically was sent by the Turkish Sultan way back in the 19th century to basically serve the community of the Cape. And then the other is Imam Abdullah Harun. Some of you know the name, the road's name basically is, of course, also in memory of that Imam who was killed in detention during the month of September 1969, on the 27th of September. Because of this Congress having been sort of taking place, it was decided to bring this event also forward and to be part of the Congress. And so we thank the Congress for doing so. So having said all of that, thank you very much for those of us who have been attending. And tonight, unfortunately, some of us who have not been invited will not be able to join us for that dinner, but we're having a dinner on this campus, and we will have the Director General of IRSICA being with us. We'll be having a launch of a book on Sheikh Abu Bakr Effendi, written by our award-winning journalist Shafiq Morton. And so I would urge many of you, even if you don't attend that, to please get hold of his book. It is one of the important interventions, intellectual intervention on biographical writing that need to be read. So hopefully, inshallah, you'll be able to access it at some point.